Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing another one of the very short introduction books, The Crusades by Christopher Tyerman. Now, this is the first time in this series I've objected to large parts of the text. And I realize that part of that is having a non-Christian write about a primarily, fundamentally Christian endeavor. And that's fine. You don't have to have a Christian write about a Christian endeavor. But if you do have that person cannot have fundamentally incorrect ideas about Christianity. Tyerman, for some reason, considers violence within the Christian tradition a fundamental contradiction. The idea that because Jesus Christ preaches peace and love, that there is no such thing as violence. And Christianity does have some pacifist strings, but within Protestant denominations. But there was no Protestantism at the time of the Crusades. So Christ did preach a gospel of love and peace. It's true. But it's nowhere said that Christians cannot engage in violence if and where necessary. There are numerous times in the Gospels where Christ refers to a sword and dividing families and there being violence. So the idea that Christianity is necessarily pacifist is wrong. And so a number of the conclusions and a number of the statements he makes are nutty and crazy on their face. So, for example, he's talking about St. Augustine and just war theory. And he's referring here to St. Augustine. From his comments, three familiar essentials emerged: just cause, defined as defensive or to recover rightful possession. So one of the reasons a just war can be fought is if somebody has invaded you or taken away something that is yours. A legitimate authority. Legitimate authority is ordering you to participate in a war or the proper intention by the participants. Thus war, inherently sinful, could promote righteousness. And I put wrong in the text. War is not inherently sinful. So right away, Tyerman gets a fundamental thing wrong about Christianity, and so some of the conclusions he draws are wrong. And once again, if you're going to write about a Christian endeavor, you should know what Christians think instead of just putting your own spin on it. Here's another one. He says, embodiments of the oxymoronic nature of Christian holy war. Christian holy war is not oxymoronic. If you knew anything about Christianity, you would know that. But instead, you've read somewhere that Christ preached a gospel of love and peace, which means no war, which means people are not allowed to fight. If someone's attacking you, you're just supposed to lie there and get your head cut off. That is not Christianity. There are strains of pacifism within certain Protestant sects, but they do not represent Christianity. Classic example of this would be a home invasion or a mugging. If somebody is trying to attack you, do something wrong to you, and in self-defense, you kill them, that is not imputed to you as a murder. You're simply trying to defend yourself. Ideally, the response should be proportional. So if somebody, I don't know, comes and taps you on the head and, you're not justified in turning around and shooting them. But obviously in a home invasion, something at night where you can't see, you can't make that sort of distinction. You are justified in defending yourself. That is well within the Christian tradition. But I'm sure Tyerman would say that it's anti-Christian, that apparently Christians are just supposed to lie down and get run over. That is not Christianity. So if you understand the Christian notion of self-defense, then you can see that applied to a larger polity. So whether that's a family, a community, a city, a nation state, however it might be. And at the time of the First Crusade in the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire had called upon the West for assistance. So go back a little further in time, Jerusalem had not necessarily been under continuous Christian rule since the death of Christ, but the idea was Christians were living in and around the area and they had easy access to all the holy sites within Palestine, as we've come to know it. And the ability to access this was not impeded. This fundamentally changed with the advent of Islam, which was invented in the 7th century. And you have it coming up and it conquers large parts of what was formerly Christian lands. And there wasn't a a unified policy. If you understand anything about how Islam has evolved politically over the centuries, there have just been different dynasties that have taken over. And at some point, the dynasty dies out and another dynasty takes over. But not all of those dynasties have had similar goals, aims, or ways of governing people. And at some point, some of those Muslim dynasties said, hey, Christians are welcome to come. We might tax them, but we're not going to stop them. Others would allow caravans to rob and steal and beat Christians up, sometimes kill them. There wasn't an even treatment because there wasn't one single monolithic Islamic empire. There were different empires over centuries. But at the time of the 11th century, the pressure was enough that the Byzantines had asked for help from the West. And so when the West came, it was not on behalf of any particular country. So this idea that it's the original settler colonial project, it's not true. There was no country coming. There weren't actually even a large number of settlers. What it was a defensive war in which what was formerly Christian lands were made open for Christians again. And what I appreciate about Tyerman is he's very honest about the relationships between Christians and Muslims during that time period. On both sides, that Muslims were not out, chopping the head off of every Christian during the times that they were in the ascendancy, and Christians were not doing that to Jews and Muslims when they were in the ascendancy either. But there were not large numbers of settlers who came. It's not in Europe, it's the Middle East, so it'd be very hard to do that. But it wasn't a colonial project because no king of Jerusalem visited any European country during the time of that reign. So let's talk about some of this. And I remember this idea of profitability when I was thinking about it, because I remembered visiting the Holy Land myself and thinking about all the ways that we as pilgrims, fellow Christians visiting the holy sites, we were helping the local economy. And this is in the 11th century. At any one time, there could be 70 pilgrim ships docked at Acre, some capable of carrying hundreds of passengers. So even in the 11th century, there was such a hunger to visit the Holy Land. Traveling on one of the two annual passages, when the currents and winds in spring and autumn allowed for easier journeys, these tourists found eager hosts. The Jerusalem kings exacted tolls on them, just as their Muslim predecessors had done. The two great military orders of the temple and the hospital were founded to protect and heal them. The catering trade grew rich on them. Residents in Outremer gave them places to visit by sprucing up old sites, excavating others, such as the relics of the patriarchs at Hebron in 1119, and imaginatively recreating the biblical landscape. In remapping the sacred landscape, the Latin Christians were following a process similar from the Roman emperors Titus and Hadrian in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Greek Christians in the 4th century, the Muslims after 638, 1187, and 1291, and the Zionists and the Israelis in the 20th century. So if you understand that, then you're in a better position to see the Crusades for what they are. And here's a very brief summary at the beginning of this text. I'll read from. Most of what passes in public as knowledge of the Crusades is either misleading or false. The Crusades were not solely wars against Islam in Palestine. They were not chiefly conducted by land-hungry younger sons, nor were they part of some early attempt to impose Western economic hegemony on the world. More fundamentally, they did not represent an aberration from Christian teaching. So I was actually really hopeful when I read this. I thought, wow, this is awesome. He's saying all the correct things. And then, as I said later on, since he has a fundamentally incorrect notion of violence within Christianity, he then draws some crazy conclusions looking at this as justification of violence, when the reality is violence is contextual within Christianity. And here he's talking about the First Crusade. The expedition arose out of a specific social, religious, ecclesiastical, and political context. All four of those are important: social, religious, ecclesiastical, and political. Western Europe was held together by a military aristocracy whose power rested on control of local resources by force and inheritance as much as by civil law. The availability of large numbers of arms bearers, nobles and their retinues, with sufficient funds or patronage to undertake such an expedition, was matched by an awareness of the sinfulness of their customary activities and a desire for penance. For them, holy violence was familiar, and Jerusalem possessed overwhelming numinous resonance. And I just thought this is so beautifully written, this idea that there were these other forces, but there was also an awareness of the sinfulness of their customary activities and a desire for penance. The Crusades were, in a way, a form of pilgrimage, a way to expiate your sins. And if you were to die in the defense of the Holy Land or the capture of the sacred places, that you were eligible for an indulgence. Now, this is something vastly misunderstood by non-Christians, specifically non-Catholics, and you may not necessarily understand it when I talk about it. Please feel free to ask me more in the comments. But the way you have to understand an indulgence is the way you have to understand repairing a harm done. So, for example, if I were to play with a ball, whatever ball you like, soccer ball, cricket ball, baseball, and the ball sails over into my neighbor's yard and it breaks the window. I go over, I tell my neighbor, I'm sorry. My neighbor says, I forgive you. You still have to pay for the window. So the idea is there is a resonance, there is a residue that's left over from a sinful act. And we know that from ourselves. For example, when you're angry and you express that anger to someone, you can feel that anger within you after the anger passes. It stays in your body almost. Well, it's the same way in the spiritual life, that when you commit a sin, there is still something that has to be repaired. Now, one of the ways that you can repair this is by penance, by acts of charity. Another is by indulgences that are given by the church as the guardian of Christ and the saints' treasury of merits. The vicar of Christ has the ability to give these indulgences for various acts. Acts have to be done. And so one of those ways was the Crusaders' indulgence, going out. You're leaving your family, leaving your country, and going to fight on behalf of this righteous cause. There was an indulgence available for that. As I say, that's a separate discussion, probably indulgences, but if you'd like to, I'm always happy to get into it. I also appreciate Tyerman's giving more context for what was normal in the mind of the Crusaders that may be difficult for us to conceptualize now. The Venetian Crusade of 1122 to 25, in a sort of foreshadowing of the Fourth Crusade, raided Byzantine territory to force a restoration of preferential trade rules. Yet it also fought a hard sea battle against the Egyptians and helped capture the port of Tyre, again in return for trading privileges and property. On return to the Adriatic, further raiding carried off booty and relics. Modern disapproval misses the essence. The Italian trading cities' contributions to crusading of men, blood, treasure, and materials were second to none. Crusading enthusiasm did not stop at the gates of commercial ports, nor did the desire for profit, or at least an avoidance of loss, contradict the spirituality, as well as the material risks inherent in taking the cross, any more than did a knight's desire to fight to earn salvation and to survive. While elements of duty, fear, devotion, repentance, excitement, adventure, material profit, and escapism feature in the sources as contributory spurs to action, one overwhelming urge, with secular and spiritual dimensions, may have been what could inadequately be described as status, with church, peers, neighbors, relatives, God. The most typical trophies of this status were relics, which the returning crusader bestowed on local churches, further enhancing both social reputation and godly credit. The lure of the unique riches of treasure houses of Christian relics at Constantinople acted as a spur to its destruction in 1204. The discredit afforded those who failed to fulfill their vows, or those who deserted or refused to enlist, alone reflected the continuing social admiration that clung to veterans of the cross. The question of whether the Christian settlements in the East can be described as colonies in any modern sense has exercised historians for 2 centuries. If a colony can be understood as, in some fashion, deliberately created to act as a subordinate in a larger commercial, economic, or strategic system, operated by a distant colonial power in its own interests, then Outremer, despite its name, hardly fits the model. If, however, a colony implies a plantation of an alien population of rulers and settlers who retain their cultural identity and association with their regions of origin, then Outremer does display colonial characteristics. However, Outremer formed part of no secular or ecclesiastical Western Empire except as provinces of the Latin Church. Outremer's distinctive characteristic of a garrison society did not guard vital sea lanes, trade routes, markets, or sources of raw material, but what many regarded as a huge religious relic, Christ's heritage. Direct material profit had not driven the conquest of Outremer, though this did not impede subsequent economic exploitation. People did not go on crusade in order to get money. It was not easy to do, and there wasn't a lot of money to be made. They went because they had a particular conviction tied together with all the other influences that Tyerman refers to. So here are some of the characteristics of life after the original Crusades and with Christians ruling the territory. After the initial stage of conquest, Muslim resistance to Frankish rule, in the absence of political leadership, which had fled, rarely reached beyond the level of localized banditry. The new rulers' and settlers' enjoyment of resources did not entail systematic persecution of other faith communities. Overt aggression to non-Christians seemed the preserve of zealous, boorish newcomers. In market courts at the port of Acre, jurors were drawn from both Latin and Syrian Christians, and witnesses were permitted to swear oaths on their holy books, Christians on the Gospel, Jews and Samaritans on the Torah, and Muslims on the Quran, because, the Jerusalem law code insisted, be they Syrians or Greeks or Jews or Samaritans or Nestorians or Saracens, they are also men like the Franks. The Hospitallers, who, there's the flag of the hospital back there, who ran the great hospital in Jerusalem, that could accommodate hundreds of patients at a time, agreed. They treated anyone regardless of race or religion. Only lepers were excluded for obvious reasons, and lepers were treated in their own special situations. So, and before I end, I should loop back in that at one point again he shows his ignorance, in which he talks about, he refers to this manuscript of Louis IX at Damietta, and he says, "There's not a cross in sight. Instead, the Crusaders are shown bearing the fleur-de-lis, royal emblem of France." Of course, forgetting that the fleur-de-lis is inherently connected to Catholicism and Christianity. He would know that if he wasn't so ignorant about Christianity, which is a problem when you're writing about the Crusades. So he thinks he's making some sort of rhetorical point. There's not a cross in sight. There's only fleur-de-lis. You can see behind me, that's the standard of Joan of Arc. Fleur-de-lis there. So it's inherently a Christian symbol, particularly a Catholic symbol, particularly associated with France, but with other, you'll see the fleur-de-lis in other coats of arms that are not French, but related somehow to the French. So once again, I'm underlining this idea that Tyerman, unfortunately, doesn't know his Christianity very well, and so he sometimes makes very ignorant statements. But overall, I still think this very short introduction is worth reading, with that in mind, that if you don't know much about Christianity yourself, you're going to be misled by Tyerman. So I can't recommend it to non-Christians because they may be very easily misled and buy more lies about what Christianity is when Tyerman doesn't know what he's talking about there. But on the other hand, there's so many times in which he says the exact right things, and I think, wow, he has managed to summarize in just a few sentences the complexity of what the Crusades were. So that part of me, that part of the writing I really appreciate. And here, I also appreciate the way that he looks at the term crusade in modern context and how inappropriate it is. General Eisenhower's order for the day of the 6th of June 1944, this was the invasion at Normandy, described the D-Day offensive as a great crusade. The connection with spiritually redemptive holy warfare had become drained of much meaning. Any conflict promoted as transcending territorial or other material aims could attract the crusade epithet, increasingly a lazy synonym for ideological conflict, or worse, a sloppy but highly charged metaphor for political conflicts between protagonists from contrasting cultures and faiths. In ways unimaginable when Runciman denounced the morality of crusading in the mid-20th century, the Crusades no longer just haunt the memory, but stalk the streets of 21st century international politics, in particular in the Near East. In an irony often lost on protagonists, these public perceptions of the Crusades that underpin confrontational rhetoric derive from a common source. The Near Eastern radical or terrorist who rails against Western neo Crusaders is operating in exactly the same conceptual and academic tradition as those in the West who continue to insinuate the language of the Crusade into their approach to the problems of the region. This is by no means a universal set of mentalities, as demonstrated from the literary and academic cliche of a civilized medieval Islamic world brutalized by Western barbarians, to the almost studiously anti-crusading rhetoric and policies of NATO and others in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, to opposition to the crude caricaturing of Islam after September 2001. The re-entry of the Crusades into the politics of the Near East is baleful and intellectually bogus. I agree with that. So, once again, a series in a very short introduction. The 120 pages cannot be recommended to non-Christians because of the distortions and misunderstandings of Tyerman in the text. But if you are a Christian and you understand that Christianity is not inherently pacific, that it's not opposed to war in and of itself, then I think this is a safe read. It also, I didn't talk about it because I wanted to talk about larger issues, but it does give you a brief history of the different crusades, as well as crusades in other parts outside of the Middle East. For example, in Spain, in Livonia, up in the Baltics. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, subscribe, share this with people who might be interested. You can buy a copy of the book. There's a link in the description below. That's one of the ways you can support this channel. You can also support by sending a contribution via Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. Those are linked. You can do a super like using YouTube. You can become a member on an ongoing basis versus via Patreon and YouTube membership. You'll get early access to videos like this one, as well as the opportunity to chat with me about different aspects of the book reviews that I do. A reminder in 2024 that any contributions that are made, a portion of those proceeds are going to go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. There's a link to them in the description. They help Palestinian children who could not otherwise get medical care get the medical care they need. I think they're a fantastic organization. Go check them out in the description. Feel free to contribute to them directly or contribute to them indirectly by supporting this channel. You'll also see a link to my Amazon wish list. If you'd like to nominate a book for 2025, just pick something off of the wish list there, buy it for me, send it my way, and you can sponsor that review. Until next time, enjoy your reading.